Alex Monk. He's a therapist that's got a book, Trauma and the Supernatural. And if welcome to the Taproot Therapy podcast. We really appreciate you coming on. Excited to get into your stuff, and please bear with me. I've got a little bit of a cold. I've been under the weather, so I'm a little bit droopy. I sometimes, if we got the video, I was trying to do a little bit of prop comedy. I was going to get some American stereotypes and show up in a cowboy hat and with a donut or something. I don't have a gun, but I'm not sure. Are those your associations? As a Londoner?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. The usual stereotypes, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Your book's fascinating, and you've got kind of an interesting perspective that I imagine cuts a little bit of the grain most places. A lot of the stuff that I'm into that I feel like is kind of inevitable and coming back into clinical practice is sort of controversial, or not controversial, but maybe poorly understood. Could you give us a precursor just to kind of your background, maybe how you got into therapy, the kind of therapy you do, and then how that leads you into your interest here? And I mean, it's interesting to me, like the book that I'm suspicious of is the one that's like, I've figured everything out, and here's a system that integrates all things, and never again will there ever need to be an innovation. And I distrust that kind of book a lot more than the person who's sort of honestly fleshing things out and hashing them out to see what they think themselves. And you can sort of see the author teaching themselves as they're teaching the audience, because it feels collaborative, it feels honest, and a lot of times those ideas are a little bit more timeless and universal. So I'd just love to hear about how you get there.
Yeah, so well, I guess my my background was, I mean, my first degree was English literature. So I've always enjoyed reading and creative aspects of life. So I also have an interest in the arts, so very much visual art, and I'm not a trained artist, but always been enjoyed painting and drawing and anything related to the arts. And I've also been a musician for a long time, performing musician.
What kind of music?
I guess it would be kind of experimental, kind of folk music, psychedelic folk, quite a lot.
Kind of like the freak folk stuff of the 70s throwback, that kind of world.
Yeah, that's right. And there was also kind of like Bert Jansch, that kind of thing, John Renbourn, those sort of Pentangle, that kind of stuff. But also in the States, you may know bands like Espers or Six Organs of Admittance, that kind of thing.
So you're taking me back to like 2005 college.
Exactly. So that new weird America kind of stuff. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever met another person that was into that scene. I was very into that scene in college. It wasn't cool then, and I haven't heard about it since, or at least where I was. Everyone was. That was the college rock days where like every song had to be like an American with a fake English or Australian accent. It was like, I am an English major. My adjectives have lots of flavor. Aren't my narratives rail swell? And that was like all that you could play on the radio.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that was a very particular scene, wasn't it? Yeah. So
is it still out there? You're still making it?
Still doing music, I mean, not so much, especially when I was kind of COVID came along, so that meant like performances were kind of cut, weren't happening. And at that time I was also writing my book, so I haven't really done anything, to be honest. I've done a couple of gigs, but I generally haven't done much. So, but I still like to kind of pick up my guitar and stuff. But yeah, it's just time, really. So yeah, I've in terms of that. But yeah, I've been doing some painting a bit more, so more visual art stuff. Cool. So that was the kind of background that I sort of have come from. So I studied that, I guess, and I've always been interested in psychology, and then I decided to study integrative arts psychotherapy, which is basically a way to integrate the two for me. That's why I decided to take that particular master's program. and from which I graduated, and then I went into generally in private practice. I was working as part of a psychiatry practice for a while, but the psychiatrist retired, so that was that. So I've been since in private practice, and I kind of got the idea, the idea of the curse position that kind of came organically. Um, I guess through reading Mark Fisher a lot, his stuff, particularly the book Ghosts of My Life, and then obviously psychoanalysis, and I have a, a strong interest in, as you can probably gather from the book, in spirituality as well, and what I'm calling in the book magical consciousness broadly, Western esotericism, the occult, and how that kind of feeds into trauma as well, the numinous, all of these kind of areas, and kind of building it around this idea of the cursed position, and how more broadly the supernatural relates to the practice of psychotherapy, and again, you probably got this from the book, the kind of prejudices that we find when it comes to spirituality, and as clinicians, that we may project onto our clients or our patients, right? So yeah,
because of our own our own religious beliefs, conscious or unconscious, you mean?
yeah, exactly. Unconscious or conscious or unconscious, yes, it may be a religious belief which is of a particular, you're a member of a particular organized religion, and then you project that onto somebody else or one of your clients, or it could be a particularly strong, atheistic or materialistic belief that
Yeah.
can be experienced as reductive or patronizing.
Yeah, I see
So
both of those be damaging. I mean, Europe, like
yeah.
Britain, is going to be a little bit more post-Christian than the US is. Do you see, religious practitioners that don't disclose it or something?
Well, I guess that would depend on, well, obviously, if there you're into territory of conversion therapy,
Yeah.
obviously like that, which is particularly toxic, pernicious. But of course, it depends on what your modality is and what the relationship is with a particular client, as to whether you're going to disclose that or not.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think obviously these unconscious projections are important. That's why we go into psychotherapy ourselves, right? Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I usually lean Jungian in some of my conceptualizations, and that whole idea that if the religious function is not conscious, that it will be projected and used unconsciously. And every
Mhm.
time somebody calls me like a pseudoscientist because I do brain spotting or somatic therapy or something on LinkedIn, I'll look at their profile and it'll have like all of this like wildly religious and conspiratorial right wing stuff while they're like, what you're
Mhm.
doing is not evidence based. And it's like, you see this kind of obsession with logic and reason, empiricism inside of therapy. A lot of times, there's those things get projected elsewhere. So it's
Yes.
I don't know. It's interesting, but you're saying also that somebody could be atheist and secularizing of somebody who's having a genuine kind of embodied experience, and then they feel condescended to, and that's damaging.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is the problem with, I mean, because obviously, again, as therapists, we have to be very careful to keep people safe, don't we? So we don't want to start idealizing psychotic, experiences as the numinous, which, because there is obviously a crossover between the numinous and
Hmm.
psychosis, and it can be very difficult to differentiate between the two. But at the same time, we don't want to kind of denigrate somebody who has a particular spiritual or numinous experience, which really means something to them. Some particular kind of synchronicity, which which can be very powerful. And somebody says, "Oh, well, that's." It may not be that the therapist kind of openly says, "Oh God, well, that's just a coincidence," but they may, it could just be a kind of raised eyebrow or a slight movement of
Yeah.
the body, as which can kind of indicate some sense of suspicion, perhaps. And so I think it's important to explore these areas with just with curiosity and openness, isn't it? And
Mhm.
yeah, so that we don't kind of patronize or infantilize people. Yeah.
No, or just a silence sometimes. I think the person brings something up about their spiritual practice or their, faith multiple times and the therapist just leaves it there. Whereas anything else that a patient brings up over and over, I mean, the first lesson, a lot of times in therapy schools, if it comes up several times, engage with it, ask questions, even if you don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But they're kind of afraid to go there or afraid to follow the patient.
Yeah, and I think another that's a really interesting area, and I think and again a difficult area, because I think if if somebody's coming to therapy, they're coming to therapy because they're having difficulties with something, they're suffering, right? That's why they go to therapy, right? Most of the time, almost all of the time. And so I think if somebody has a particular experience, it's something that can be looked at from a spiritual perspective, in terms of its connection, say, to the Jungian big S self, in terms of a larger cosmological sort of constellation of reality, if you like. But it also may also they also need to speak about their relationship to their caregivers and what it means from that
Mm.
perspective, and it will also have meaning. And I think so. I think in therapy we don't really we need to have curiosity, and so if there is a sense that there's something which is off limits, then obviously I think that's something that needs to, and it keeps coming back, then obviously that's something that needs to be addressed, isn't it?
Hmm. And some of the language around the curse position that you're describing reminds me of James Hellman talking about constellation, which is he
Right.
was taking that from astrology, but he would talk about as a way of not pathologizing somebody and making things more of like a system of forces that we're trying to find equilibrium. Would say, this part of you is constellating, this thing in the world, meaning that it's temporary, that it's just a part of you, helping them get distance on something, even while experiencing it, in a profoundly affecting way. Could you say a little bit about why the language of the supernatural is useful? Why bring that into therapy and how you see it help, clinically?
How do you mean by bringing in the language of the supernatural?
Well, a curse, right? I mean, the curse is
Oh,
not
I
a
see. Yeah, yeah,
medical
yeah, yeah.
condition,
I
so right,
understand. Yeah, 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 yeah.
which
So,
DSM number is that, or ICD-10 or over there? Yeah.
so I guess, yeah. So with the curse, I think so. If I mean, came up with something similar called. I don't. Sorry, yeah, I don't know this kind of particular. I know a little bit of Hillman, but I don't know that particular idea of the constellation. But um, Freud came up with this idea called fate neurosis, right? Where you have this what he calls like a daimonic psychological entity, if you like, which keeps coming back and repeating, and a person keeps having these kind of events that keep happening, which are um, kind of inexplicable. They just keep having bad luck and bad things keep happening to them. But it's like, well, but it can't even really be attributed to anything in particular. So, but like, I think this was later on in Freud's career. So he'd kind of abandoned the whole kind of real trauma and
Mhm.
replaced it with the unconscious fantasy, right? So by this stage, he wasn't really looking at trauma. So that's where I kind of brought back in a way, if you think of it in those Freudian terms, to bringing back the trauma as a means of explaining this repetition compulsion. The reason for the curses is because the way that the person experiences this repetition can seem like a supernatural entity, as if this inexplicable thing that keeps happening to them. They experience it as if it's outside of them, as if somebody has a special power, or some entity has some particular supernatural power to cause this person misfortune. So hence the curse, and it has some parallels with what you see, or what you saw during the witch trials in the early modern period, where people are accused of being witches and are cursing their neighbors and so forth, right?
Mhm.
So it's something like it's on, but the kind of phenomenological kind of nature of the psychological experience feels a bit like that. So it's very, very, very powerful. So that's the connection with the kind of the supernatural, rather than it just being a purely materialistic
Mhm.
phenomenon. Yeah.
Well,
Hence language.
I think, and anybody who does any sort of practice that works with dreams, I mean, you definitely see there be pretty traditional kind of like curses and monsters show up.
Yeah.
Um, and like a lot of times, if I have a patient who is thinking about making a big life change to get healthy, maybe they don't want to drink anymore, or they're going to do something, but it is, in the back of my head, I'm saying, okay, the unlived life of the parent, though, no one in your family has done this, or you were raised to feel like this is not something that you deserve or can do, then I'm that's in the back of my head 2 weeks later when they start to have dreams about a werewolf gene in their body, or a vampire looking in the window, these things watching them, whereas it's like, does it feel like you're cursed? Does it feel like you're haunted, like you can't get away from this thing that's somehow in you, epigenetically or
Yeah.
something?
Absolutely, yeah, and the epigenetically kind of feeds in, I guess, doesn't it, to the intergenerational aspect of it, the intergenerational aspect of the trauma, which of course we're not conscious of. We don't know what our ancestors have passed down to us, and like those kind of ancestral elements can appear in dreams as well. Those familial kind of constructs, or objects, or whatever language or metaphor you want to use to represent them, they do stalk the unconscious. And that was another book that was a big influence on me. Was my work was I probably know this, it's quite famous, the Donald Cowshed's book.
Yeah, I was going to ask
Right.
if you had read him, but
Yeah.
it's so similar.
Yeah, the inner world of trauma. So yeah, and
I
you've
was
got
thinking Trauma in the Soul was the one that was
I
the one.
don't know that one actually. I've only read that one, The Inner World of Trauma.
Trauma in the Soul has a lot of possession and angels and things showing up, psychically.
Yeah, yeah. So so yeah, that definitely where you've and so I think these kind of, yeah, these entities in the deepest layers of the unconscious, that's
Mhm.
very kind of cowshed as well. But it is interesting because you also have that in psychoanalysis as well, because Melanie Klein talks about the deepest layers of the unconscious, in a similar way to kind of Jung did, which you wouldn't kind of expect from Melanie Klein, that below the unconscious, there's a deeper layer where we have these kind of
Mhm.
entities which kind of coming up, and she calls that, but obviously in Melanie Klein's terms, this isn't related to an archetypal system. It's related to an archaic mother, an archaic relationship with the mother, right?
Yeah.
So but there are some interesting crossovers, and I can't remember where I heard this, but somebody once said that the reason why you get these weird crossovers with Jung and Klein was because their build, they were basically next door to each other at one point, their training
Mm.
institutes. So yeah, so you've got this kind of weird, and also you have that in the still today in the training. One of the Jungian trainings here is very Kleinian. Anyway, I'm going
Well,
off
they also work
piece a
with
bit here, but
psychotics.
yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of times when you're working with schizophrenia, you see deeper layers of the psyche. It may take years to get to, just in talk therapy at the surface level. Um,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, but I think with in terms of the curse position and this archaic unconscious is very important, because it's the archaic unconscious which actually is related to the spiritual or the numinous experience, right? To the synchronicities that we have, the dreams that we have that mean something to us. And again, coming back to Kalsched, I can't remember, it's a long time since I read that book, but I think he's saying, and I'm sure Jung would have probably agreed with this, that that there's a healing, isn't there,
mhm.
that's where we can find the healing from those deepest elements of the unconscious. It's not coming from the ego, it's through this unification as much as possible. But where but where I sort of differ from Jung, and again I don't know much of Hillman, but this idea of wholeness and the archetypal system, I kind of I go along with that up to a point, but then I feel I kind of diverge from it in other ways, because for the first reason is because I feel like sometimes becomes very much is in danger of becoming universalized a little bit through these archetypes and the archetypal system, and through the collective unconscious, and can take away from very unique subjective experience. And secondly, I think that and it's interesting because you had a guest on your show. I can't remember the gentleman's name, sorry, but he was talking about the Aztecs. It was very interesting. I've only
Oh,
seen
James
half.
Maffei. Yeah.
Yeah, he was great, really interesting, and he was talking about the symbol, and you were kind of talking about the Jungian analyst and all of this, and like I think that, and our sort of Western perspective of art, and he's saying no, for the Aztecs that wasn't art actually, and so it's our sort of, and this isn't only Jung, it's across the whole of psychotherapy really, this kind of, and perhaps we can say modern Western culture as a whole, the fixation with the symbol, the need to symbolize. We always kind of need to, as he said, your guest said, represent rather than present, right? So that was very, very interesting. And I think, again, coming back to what I was saying earlier about being reductive in psychotherapy, we can be in danger of doing that, of this sort of, so this means this, or this means that, or this is that, and
the
we
interpretation becomes
yeah.
like the cage that you can't see outside of.
And I think Hillman talks about that, doesn't he, in Dream and the Underworld, like our need to interpret dreams, right? We need to kind of row back on that a bit and kind of see the dream for what it actually is, what it's telling us, rather than interpreting it through a sort of symbolic structure.
Yeah, and Hillman had a interest in turning. You're talking about the monism of Jung being kind of threatening for that it to be monadic, and that everything goes back around to some source. I mean, Hillman broke that source apart into almost a polytheistic way. I think he never really found a language for the system. Like, he had a critique, but he never really built the system to kind of implement that perspective. And I think that conversation is still kind of happening with the post-Jungians. A lot of them are more experiential or somatic. I mean, the most interesting models to me are the people that left the psychoanalytic and the depth psychology institutes, in the 70s and 80s to make more kind of embodied and experiential models. Those people didn't have a whole lot of influence then, but I see their stuff coming back now.
Yes, I can imagine with all the kind of, because with all the trauma literature as well, it's kind of empirically proving, or proving that this was valid, right? Essentially,
Well,
valid is a bit of a weak adjective, but yeah,
that it may be perennial, maybe. I mean, that people notice this phenomenologically. Now we have tools to kind of understand it neurologically, but it's the same information. It's not really a new discovery.
Yeah.
So could you give some ideas of, like, just for the people listening, where that's kind of a heady concept, like how you implement this in the room? Not a case study necessarily, unless you want to, anonymize one, or make one more generic. But could you talk about, like, when you're working with the curse position, here's where you define things, here's where the person gets out, and here's the technique, maybe?
Yeah. So I think, well, obviously it depends on what the presentation is, but I think broadly my approach is an integrative one, and what I mean by that is that I be thinking about what the meaning of the curse is for the particular individual, what that means to them, and does it have is it purely that they see it as a psychological aspect of themselves, or do they actually see it as coming from the outside? Do they see it as an external or supernatural threat to the person? And I'd be looking at it from those perspectives, and I would be exploring it through the relationship. So I'd be working very much through a psychodynamic frame, working with the relationship, how working with my own countertransference, working with my own experiences of the person who's sitting in front of me. And if there is a particular traumatic element to it, then I may or may not use EMDR, which can be very, very helpful with traumatic experiences, particularly with relational or developmental trauma, as you know, right? But I think it's very important to think about how to help the person to think about how that they're identifying with the curse, right? So because the curse position is very much a place of powerlessness, helplessness, and there's this sense of something very aggressive which is continually coming back to the person, which is haunting them. So to first of all explore somebody's family history and where they think this may be coming from. What does the curse mean to them? But then also to think about their own aggression. What are they angry about? What's causing the rage? Because often there can be with the curse there can be very strong internalized object or entity which is very attacking, where psychoanalytically a superego, which you're useless, you're rubbish, you're not going to do anything, you're not going to achieve anything in your life. So to enable the person to think about what that might mean to them. So it might be like you were kind of saying, like it could be a neglectful or an abusive parent that they're identifying with. And through their identification with that particular internal object, if you like, that internalized parent or caregiver, they're destroying their own lives, right? They're kind of they're just tearing themselves to pieces. That may be through all kinds of it could be through an addiction, or it could be through damaging relationships, or it could be by protecting an internalized perpetrator of abuse, so that they keep kind of going back to the abusive caregiver and they keep kind of going along with that. So I think in terms of treatment, in my experience, the internal world is shifted by what the person does in the external world. So if therapy can help somebody to go back through the positive relationship with the therapist, right, through the experiences of having, if you like, a good object, that they've kind of internalized through the therapy, then they can start to kind of stand up to people, the bullies in their life. They can start putting boundaries up in their lives, and start to say no to people. They can start to develop more healthy relationships, which are not only based on self-destruction or transgression. They can be based on cherishing other people, tenderness, care, all of these things, and then they can start to do that. And then that then calms down this kind of harsh, kind of cursing superego in there. And so I think when it comes to exploring the spiritual aspects of somebody's experience, that then can, once they've gone through those stages, then they can really think about the spiritual aspects of their lives as something which is much more grounded, that they can participate in. Because I think if you don't do all of that work, this famous phrase, spiritual bypass, there is a danger that you can kind of see, spiritual experiences as a kind of way to avoid all of the things that I've been talking about. So I think that's in the broad brushstrokes, that's the way I kind of work, really.
So I mean, I think another thing is, I think you say this in some of the marketing materials for the book, but that this doesn't make clinicians pick between the reality, the material reality of a spiritual experience, that you're kind of giving people who have a varied system of faith, maybe somebody's scientific materialistic, maybe somebody else is a little bit more spiritual, a shared language where we don't have to sit down and say, well, I want to make sure you respect my beliefs, even though a lot of times people need to clarify that in therapy, but this is just kind of an open-ended language where we can have a conversation that's useful, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely. But obviously, you will come. There will be conflict. There's conflict in the therapeutic relationship that will come up. I mean, if somebody feels that they are cursed, right? They're not going to have whether the curse is a metaphor or if they think they actually are cursed.
Mhm.
They either way, they are not going to be seeing you as a benign object, right? As a
Mhm.
therapist. So I think as a therapist, you have to hold a lot of kind of negative transference, right? And you need to be able to explore that with curiosity with the person. And yeah, they may think that that you have they could have all kinds of fantasies around what kind of belief you have, whether you're whatever the color of your skin, whatever clothes you wear, right? However, whatever your accent is, etc., etc. And they've come to you for a reason, right? There's pre-transference. They've heard things about you. They'll have ideas when they come into the room. So all of these things are important, aren't they?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and usually, it's the Freudians that give me pushback for being too, like, woo-woo if I write something or whatever. They'll say, like, "Well, this isn't evidence-based," or "This is too out there," but, um
Evidence-based from Freudians.
yeah, that's
Okay.
well, I've
Okay.
I've seen Jungians try and hide behind it too, which is always kind of funny.
Okay.
Um, the depths of phenomenology, except science is useful, when we wanna not, look at something, but what is it? I don't like, there was somebody that I was talking to at a conference, and, are you familiar with, like, Eric Berne, like, game theory, the
Yeah, the transactional
game.
analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, where he's, like, putting Freud together with John Nash, I guess, game theory and
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
psychoanalysis. But, they liked that background, and they was saying, like, "Okay, what's wrong with talking about a curse? Like, what is a curse, right? What is Bluebeard about, right? Domestic abuse. What is, and I'm blanking the name, but the myth where the daughters are dancing all night
Yeah.
long and they look drowsy and the dad's saying what's wrong and they can't talk about what's happening at night and their shoes are worn out on the bottom because they're dancing all night long and he has to figure out why they're going into the fairy world and break it. Like, what is this about? Danger to your children, this secret, a secret thing that's affecting the house that you can't see, that, as a father, you're supposed to be able to protect your daughters. Like, this is just like the games we play. Like, you're coming in, you're saying, what is the problem? How do I fix it? What is the riddle or the game to get out of
Yeah.
this thing? And when people are saying, what's the point of talking about these things in kind of mythological language? I think I was talking about Marie von Franz or something. And it
Mm.
was like, because it's the same thing as the patient knows how to play this game. They're continuing to play the same game that they learned in their family, consciously or unconsciously. We're helping them get out. That's what these myths are about too. Bluebeard is,
Yes.
how do you know that you kind of know the domestic abuse is there, but how do you continue to make enough contact with yourself, have enough pride as a woman, have enough assertiveness to get out of the situation and ask for help, or to explore, look at the thing that you are afraid of before it kills you. It's all the same thing to me. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I mean, the myth thing is an interesting one clinically, isn't it? Because I think if the person has to bring in, I mean, the patient that has to bring in their own myths, right? Whatever it might be, it could be a Netflix show. It could be, that they're talking about, Oedipus Rex or whatever,
Mhm.
anything in between those things, right? And I think sometimes I've thought, oh, it'd be great. What a great idea to bring this. I might mention this kind of myth, and I'll kind of feel quite Jungian and
Mhm.
kind of intellectual. And I've done that, and actually, it's like, and it's fallen flat,
Mhm.
because it means nothing, and it doesn't have any bearing on that person's kind of deep psychological material, right? So I've really kind of been conscious not to kind of bring that in. Yeah, but yeah, definitely. I think with von Franz, that's the kind of genius of Jung and von Franz, isn't it? That if you do have that sense of mutuality about the myth, if they
Mhm.
can really kind of, and that kind of Pinkola Estes book as well about the wolves. If you can really get
Yeah.
into that, find a way to get down in there with the person, then it's absolutely brilliant. But I think that takes real skill to kind of be able to do that. That's what I mean.
What about anime and video games? I mean, I see that be the mythological system of everybody under 30 who comes in with
Yeah,
me is because a lot of
absolutely.
the
Yeah,
a lot of the anime I know or the video game I know, and then some of them I don't. I don't really have. I have if it's not 10 years old, I probably don't know what it is. But when they're talking about it, they're telling you like, yeah, so there's two brothers, but one brother's cursed, and that brother is bad, but he's really the real hero because whatever. And it's like I don't know the story, but it's just like this is mythology. Like these are,
yeah,
these I do know the story, even though I don't know this video game. So I think
absolutely.
maybe coming in and being like, oh, let me teach you about Oedipus is kind of dry.
Exactly.
My bow tie is, spinning around and they're confused about, but mythology is there, whether or not you see it, it's not always this stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. That kind of, yeah, that fusty sort of analyst or therapist is kind of, yeah, not a thing to be desired these days. I think we have to find ways of kind of, well, there's nothing new about that, right? Of connecting with our clients, right?
Sure.
Hmm.
So, but I mean, a lot of the book is about taking this beyond metaphor, that it doesn't have to represent, like, it may be a metaphor and that it isn't a metaphysical reality, but it isn't a metaphor and that this is a reality that we're dealing with in the room because the person feels this way. You know, can you say anything about that kind of phenomenology and what you write?
Yeah, could you just say open that up a little bit more so I can kind of,
Well, I think a lot of times there's an insecurity in that people feel like, well, and I feel I get a little bit of that. I understand a little bit of it, but there's because even on here, it's like I don't want to overqualify things sometimes in case it's somebody's first episode or whatever. But
mm,
you have a lot of times we say something and we feel like we have to pick between, well, here is the metaphorical interpretation of this isn't really real, but there's a psychological reality that the
yeah,
myth or the curse is describing. And then over here where we're saying, I believe in magic, I'm gonna bury a duck egg at midnight and burn sage, and I think that this is just as empirical as
yeah,
cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think sometimes trying to talk about the metaphysical reality of the world, like I'm a therapist, not a priest. If you're bringing a
yeah,
reality into the office, I'll
yeah,
inhabit it with you in almost kind
yeah.
of a shamanic way, and we'll be there together. And I'm not really trying to qualify or think about what that is. I'm
No,
not going to encourage something dangerous. I'm going to recognize, an ego dissolution that's maybe leaning towards psychosis in a way to help you. But that
yeah,
is the experience. I'm not encouraging it. I'm validating it and then participating in it, not enabling.
absolutely.
I don't know. Is that too open? Is that too
Absolutely.
much?
No, 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 absolutely. I think it's I think in the world we live now, particularly, there is such a closing down of curiosity and the holding the tension of not knowing, and of, when if somebody asks you, do you believe in this or not, and it becomes like a binary. Do you believe in God? Yes or no? This kind of question. Do you that do you believe what I'm saying to you? And as a therapist, we have to believe what our clients are telling us, right? We have to. We can't be kind of thinking that what they're telling us is a lie. But on the other hand, we're also thinking at the same time, what does this mean? And we need to find a way to explore with our clients the meaning of what they're telling us, and whether that is that they've actually been to the woods that day and they've seen a fairy, um, or that they've actually just broken up with their partner, and or they're having problems at work. Uh, these kind of experiences with a fairy, say a fairy sighting. Are we just going to dismiss this as psychosis, or are we going to think about what that means to that person without kind of becoming over anxious and making an interpretation of it, and just holding that open? I don't think there's anything problematic about that, unless we, obviously, if that particular person has um, problems, is very unwell and they're having psychotic episodes and we're concerned about that person, then that's another matter and we have to think about that, right? It's coming back to what I said about risk and safety. But it may not be that. It may simply that this person has had an incredible experience. They've had this numinous experience. They've seen something in the wood. They've seen this fairy in the woods. It really has changed their life. It's changed their whole reality. And let's think about that. Wow, what an incredible thing that happened to you, you know. So yeah, I think we have to hold all of those things open. Yeah, but the person, I think, but the other thing about that is that obviously clients can have a sneaking suspicion as well that the person is just saying, yeah, I believe you, or oh, how interesting, you know, or I validate your experience, and there's a sense of artifice about that, right? There's a lack of sincerity. You know, trust in the relationship has to be built. It's not
Yeah, I
just about
validate your experience is a terrifying phrase. That's gonna make me head for the door.
yeah, so you know what I mean, right? That's kind of hard won, isn't it? That's hard won from the therapist, and that takes time. So
Do you
yeah.
think it can be taught, or you think we just look for students that know how to do it and then give them a language for it?
I think no, I think it can only come really. It can be taught a little bit, but it also through our own. Obviously, we really need to have our own therapy. That's how we learn to be therapists, I think, through having our own experience of therapy. So that's like number one, through supervision, super important. Number two, and also through experience, I guess, and our own life experiences, our own experiences maybe of you know, of synchronicity or the uncanny or weird stuff happening that cannot be explained through kind of material explanations, and kind of accepting that. All of those things are very important. You know, trying to, you know, perhaps writing down our own dreams. You know, the more we understand about ourselves, the better, right? So that we can kind of. But yeah, I would say, but the most important thing is relationship, isn't it, with the person? Yeah.
Yeah, and you talk about the kind of Western esoteric magic influence in a lot of your work. Do you look at anthropology much? You know, you
Well,
look at.
yeah, I mean, in the book, there is a chapter in the book where I'm looking at these because I'm exploring. There's a chapter, I can't remember, it's chapter 8 or 9, where I'm talking about the evil eye.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot about, because I wanted to think about aggression, and in relation to the curse, because as I was saying earlier, when you were asking me about treatment, how we work with the curse, you know, is, and how the person's identifying with the aggressive, you know, such an aggressive thing to be cursed or curse somebody. It's a terrible thing, you know, putting pins in a voodoo doll, you know, it's awful. Making an image, you know, a puppet of somebody, and you know, and burning it or whatever you do, you know, it's nasty, isn't it? So there's a real aggression there. So I wanted to explore that through a more kind of through anthropological research. So I was looking at that through examples in Ethiopia with the Buddha, Buddha, the Buddha people, and their relationship with another tribe there, which, and there's a lot of conflict, and essentially it turned out to be a really helpful example of how to think about aggression and how that relates to the supernatural. Okay, so how that relates to agency, because if you think about, because it seemed to me anyway, looking at this anthropological research of the Buddha people, that the hyena became a very was a symbol. If we again, there's the word symbol, a representative or a carrier of the curse, right? So the hyena embodied all that was evil and was like that could cause harm.
And hyena
And
probably a scary thing. There's probably, you know, some evolutionary biological reasons why you think
absolutely,
the hyena is going to bring bad stuff to the village. It's going to eat your baby, or you know.
absolutely. So but there's this kind of, but the Buddha people also are um, also are have a very strong relationship to the supernatural in terms of their capacity to shapeshift. So the themselves and actually ride these hyenas and to shapeshift themselves, and are very connected to the spirit world. To this other tribe, which I can't remember the name of, they were very threatened by the Buddha people because of their putative supernatural powers, right? So, but but the Buddha people were very much a disenfranchised population, right? They were disadvantaged compared to the other tribe, whose name again I can't recall, but so they were very dominated by this other group of people, right? So it was something along the lines of colonialism. You might look at it in those terms. And their means of pushing back against that was through their capacity to shapeshift, to identify with the aggressive aspects of the curse. And also we see this with, and again this is in the book, I thought Emma Wilby, who's a historian in the UK, her book was just brilliant, really helpful, because it was thinking about how, very much in terms of witchcraft and the witch trials in the UK, how it's always seen as taboo for the witches to actually genuinely be cursing, right? To actually genuinely be doing that, to using kind of quote unquote black magic, right? Because, and she says that it's become taboo because there's something uncomfortable about women's aggression. So men don't like the fact that these, so like, because of course these women, the witches were forced to confess to things that they didn't do. Yes, absolutely. But on the other hand, what she's saying, yeah, okay, but why is it still taboo though to think about the fact they might have done that, and that kind of still exists around today. So there's something about that aggression. So, but that aggression can be powerful, and so you can get really, that can be a source of agency. And I think it was, and if you look at again at those that in the cases of witchcraft, we can perhaps, obviously I don't know, but I'm imagining that could have been a source of agency, right? A source of empowerment. And that can be also for our clients as well, if they can find a vehicle to express all of the rage that they feel about their trauma, whether it's towards the therapist, whether it's through other means, however they do that there's something very important about that, and exploring that in the therapy. So yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of the things that, like, I hear you say in the book where you're talking about, they're more the kind of cultural and sociological thing of, like, we take our anger, and we put it in a magical belief system or a series of hierarchies and rules and order, or some sort of, system that we have to inhabit, and that a lot of therapy is pulling it back and saying, no, you are angry, you do have this agency, and pulling it back into the individual, out of the system,
Yeah.
by reflecting on it. I was wondering more when I said anthropology about, like, the kind of evolutionary or biological, precedent for some of these things, like, looking at um, the Neolithic, religion or something, where a lot of these things I think were more embodied. It's
Yeah.
not like um, we look at it as like the people who say, like, oh, well, you shouldn't think that way or something. It's like, no, we do think that way. We did for a long time. We now have the ability to think multiple different ways, but
Yeah.
sometimes we have to go back into the old way in order to heal the process, because that's where the problem is coming from. Like, I do a lot of complex PTSD, and especially dissociative disorders, and
Right.
so a ton of what I'm trying to explain there is, like, we've made these processes unconscious because our brainstem is handling them for us, basically. So that
Yeah.
intuition is coming from the same place as our trauma response, because they're all just ways that we've learned to basically offload, past all of this other processing to something else. And so when I say, my head hurts, it feels like a curse, like this is just happening to me, but it's my head. If I really do somatic work and I feel the tension and I feel what I'm doing and my emotional response, I can go back and take over that old thought process that was just offloaded to when I see a man in a red sweater every morning when I go to work, this activates this old trauma and my body gets tight. And this is what I have to do with these emotions. And I don't have any control of it. This is just something that my body does, in a Paleolithic society or something, when we're semi-conscious or coming into consciousness, we're unloading all of this information into the environment. The river is alive. The rain cloud is thinking for me. It's telling me that I need to go do
Yeah,
this. It was this older way of being. And if you work
yeah,
with psychosis or something, you see that happening again. And like, yeah, you're not functional. It's not, the goal isn't to be there, but kind of being in that experience where a lot of our cognition is offloaded to the environment and embodied, and we're thinking very magically. I don't think it's Is that making sense? I mean, I don't mean to go
yeah.
too far in the woods with your idea. Like, I think the
No,
way that it's taught in school by the CBT people, when you learn that, is that there was a group of cavemen that was like, we don't have science yet. And so what we need to do is think that there's a cloud that if we light this meat on fire is going to bring rain, which wasn't it. It was
yeah,
that huge relationship with the environment where it was thinking for me. I see this means this. And a lot of your work, it kind of reminds me of that sort of early thing of put part of your consciousness back in your environment, do a ritual, and then bring it back into your own head, and then
yeah.
have that. I don't know. I've talked too much. I apologize.
No,
But
no, no. I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, I think that from that sort of anthropological lens, I think I say again in the book about James Fraser's work in the Golden
yeah.
Bough, and how that's problematic because we have this kind of idea of animistic consciousness first, then magical as part of magical consciousness, going through to religious consciousness, and then through to science, which is the apex. It's the pinnacle of what we can achieve, and isn't it amazing what we've done? And sort of through this progressive cycle, and in that, along the way, we've kind of repressed so much of that early way of being in the world, through that animism, and through having that relationship with, as you say, with nature through the river and the trees, so that we can actually. So if you do see a fairy in the woods, it's going to be obviously a lot more normal in those terms, and I think the more attuned we become to those kind of ways of being in the world, so if we do take a walk in the woods on our own, for example, maybe it's dusk, and we look at a tree, we might see a face in there that looks a bit like a fairy, and we think, my God, what was that? And it was probably just the configuration of the tree, but it kind of looked alive, and it's that sort of, those liminal areas of reality, which are so important, and that we just dismiss through this kind of materialistic way of being in the world, as if, that's the kind of the best way to be, and that it becomes very, very boring and reductive. And I think I also mentioned in the book about this, this artist like Austin Osman Spare, who talks about going back and finding this simplicity. He really reveres simplicity. So he kind of reverses the evolutionary cycle. So he's saying we should go back kind of to the simplicity of the amoeba, right?
Hmm.
Kind of draw upon that, and there's also obviously the child, if you like. The child is compared, in this kind of Fraser's terms in the Golden Bough, or in Freud's terms also, as this kind of, and there's this sort of developmental kind of line, if you like, but the child is compared to the this animistic period. Do you see what I mean? So they were just kind of
Hmm.
children. They didn't really know what they were doing. They were seeing fairies in the trees. Look at those silly people. But actually, what Spare was saying is, that's that kind of the simplicity of the child is what we should kind of be aiming for, rather than kind of just dressing it up in all of this kind of nonsense, really.
Hmm.
And so if you look at Freud's model of repression, you know, it's all about how we've repressed our sexual or aggressive drives, right? And they can't be incorporated into the ego. Fair enough, absolutely, there is that going on, but and he's kind of pointing at that's the reason why you have this weird stuff going on, because it's down to this sort of repression. But actually what I'm saying in the book is like, yeah, but you've also repressed this animistic consciousness. And
Mhm.
that's why, I mean, Freud writes in the essay The Uncanny about his own uncanny experiences, and he's wondering why he's having them. Well, you know, I think that's a good reason why, right? Because you're kind of saying that they're just part of this part of history that's dead, but you can't kill that off, as you're saying, in the depths of the
Mhm.
psyche, in the depths of the brainstem. It's still there, you know.
Well, I think Freud too, said that like he wants to reduce everything down to sexuality because he's saying that everything, the first impulse that we have evolutionarily is going to be, mate selection, and the most dominant thing passes on its genes or whatever. But we have multiple levels of the brain other than natural selection that were designed to solve other problems.
Yeah.
It didn't just start with that and then get bigger and bigger and bigger and better at it. There's actually three, or depending on how you want to sort them, multiple competing drives, like in consciousness, of which
Yes.
sexuality is only one.
Yes.
So
And I. Yeah, so go on. Go on.
no, that's it. Just to reduce it down to that is, how do you do that?
Yes, and I think that's where the work of Jaak Panksepp comes in, doesn't it? And Mark Solms, I know the psychoanalyst who's retranslated the collected works of Freud, has kind of incorporated that into psychoanalysis. So I think that's a really helpful update as well, so that you've got those. It's not only about those two. It's not about the life and death instinct. It's also about our curiosity, our seeking, and our fear, and our panic, and all of that. And also that's bringing back to mythology again. Coming back to the curse position. If you think about Pan, and the kind of the panic that Pan sort of causes, but it's by being in touch with our internal Pan, if you like, which can really help us to get in touch with those more animistic, primitive parts of ourselves, right? Which can
Hmm.
be really helpful for healing.
Yeah, and the only way I think to heal them and to be present with them is to quit thinking about them. Metaphor is still thinking. It's still me getting distance between this thing and me by
That's right.
saying, but it isn't real in this other way that's threatening, and it really has to be something that you go back into and just feel. Who knows where it comes from? I'm not pretending to know, but you do have to feel it in order to go through it.
Yes, and I think that's the great value of because I really value the weird. I really value the uncanny. I've all these kind of strange experiences that we cannot explain. These are sources of mystery. And like Arthur Machen, the writer, says, well, everything ends in mystery. That's what's written on his grave. And I just love that, because it's all about that these things are offerings, aren't they? They're windows into that kind of mysterious world. I mean, and we see this with writers as well. We see that, when I was a child, I remember the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. These portals into other worlds. We need to have that kind of connection with it, but that doesn't come through a contrived means of finding it. Kind of just happens through kind of unpredictable, strange experiences a lot of the time. But also importantly, I recently was writing a short essay on this, called about relational presence, because we often have these kind of experiences where, like you and I are now, when we're speaking to other people, or when we're with people that are close to us, we have because with affect is so important, the emotions are so important for experiences of the supernatural or spiritual. They're often in communion with other people, or with animals, or with plants, or with nature. these are all really, really important for healing, aren't they? Getting off, and also getting out of this kind of getting off the phone, and getting out into the world, and allowing ourselves to dream and experience states of reverie, and daydreaming, rather than, like you're saying, just this kind of cognitive prison that we can easily get stuck in.
You can't think your way out of a myth. I think that's
No.
the overly interpretive mythographers are the ones that I'm a little suspicious of.
Yeah.
The ones who realize that we are part of it are a little bit more interesting.
Yes, it's kind of getting away from this as if mentality, isn't it? Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you want to kind of touch on from the book? And I think we gave people probably a pretty good overview of what,
Yeah.
where to get going with it, or your other work,
Yeah, well, not really. I guess what I've been trying to think about for a while, is how in the modern world, how we can incorporate, a theory of mind which incorporates these realities. You have, so that it doesn't become reductive, it doesn't become as if, so that we
Mhm.
can, in psychotherapy, particularly because that's obviously our profession, how we can do that. And I guess we have all sorts of interesting sort of ontologies now, don't we? With like things like panpsychism, and um, all kinds of other ways of seeing reality, which you may or may not agree with. But it seems that things are opening up quite a lot, aren't they?
Yeah.
All of the different kind of subcultures, if we call them that, like within our culture, shamanism, paganism, etc., that we can, lots of interest in witchcraft, in tarot, and so I think it's a very, very exciting time. So yeah, how, I suppose, when we're thinking about the mind, how can we think about spirit? How do we, are entities part of our mind, or I mean, it's the eternal question, isn't it? Do they have their own agency? You know,
Mhm.
and I think we can have both. I think that we can have the entities which are in our minds, right? But we also have entities which have their own agencies that we can't apprehend and that we don't know, and
You
that
ever
sometimes that can be uncomfortable for people to think about, I think.
Yeah, very, very uncomfortable because it's disembodying. It's taking away the certainty that, I think a lot of therapy at the root is making people one, admit, and then two, become more comfortable with the fact that we have very little control. And a lot of the symptoms are trying to pretend that we have more control than we do, you
Yeah,
know,
absolutely,
over something. Have you ever
absolutely.
looked at that idea of the post secular sacred? David Tacey writes about it a lot, but it comes
No.
from Jung. There Jung had this idea that there were kind of going to be these three epochs. That earlier, there was this, you know spiritual literalism, that the myth, the magic was just real, and that you participate in it, and then that was overthrown for this kind of age of modernist science, where the only thing that was real was the objective, and the subjective was kind of gone. And that eventually that would fall apart because what we were observing was going to become so vast and complicated that we couldn't completely understand it objective anyway. And then there would be this, what Tacey says is a post secular sacred, where people say, okay, but quantum physics, but these huge abstract systems are also something that we don't really understand. So there is it's useful to have sort of a metaphorical definition of God. It's useful to bring back some of these ideas, and to have a little bit more kind of poetry and subjective experience, which,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think there is a, yeah, I don't know David Lacey's work at all, but
Tacey, it's a,
Tacey,
yeah.
sorry, David Tacey. Yeah, I don't know his work, but I think there is that tendency, isn't it? Which we can easily fall into, to kind of, we need to sort of, again, there's that word validate, sort of validate our experience by, oh, look, in quantum physics, you have this, and this is what it's kind of, it's proven. And then all you end up doing is undermining your own kind of experience or your own ontology, and I
Mhm.
think that's kind of, why do you always have to seek something else? And I think, say for example, the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips, his writing is great, and he sees psychoanalysis as a form of art, as
Hmm.
a kind of poetry, and he's not kind of looking for it to be any more than that. But there's something about that poetry and that art that heals. Do you see what I mean?
Hmm.
So I think if we can kind of just settle a bit with what we have and kind of explore that and be okay
Hmm.
with that. We don't always kind of need to validate it with this kind of external other, that
Yeah.
always knows better. It's very Lacanian, isn't it? That this other that knows more than us,
Hmm.
Yeah.
Do you ever build a computer or anything in the or probably of the age where that was a possibility? I don't know that.
I would be completely useless at that.
Really?
No, I haven't. I very much like synthesizers, and messing around with like that kind of knob twiddling, as it were. Just
Hmm.
like, but the actual, the understanding what's under the hood, I wouldn't have a faintest idea. I'm afraid. Yeah.
Well, there's some like I was old enough to actually that your computer came in several boxes and you put it together, but that like the when I used to be an EMDR clinician, now I do primarily brain spotting
Right.
and ETT, but the one of the models of same idea of consciousness I use for people who have that language is like you have your CPU, which is the central
I know
processor.
what that is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's really good at doing any kind of random calculation. So it can do a lot of very different things. You open a Word document, you open a video, you open a web browser, and then you have your GPU, which is able to do calculations really quickly that just have a couple numbers different, but millions of those incredibly quickly. So if you want to see the light reflecting off a gun in a first person shooter or physics, water moving, or it's doing a spreadsheet of problems incredibly fast, but it's not flexible. The CPU
Mhm.
offloads all that to it, and that's kind of getting deeper into the brainstem, where you've got this thing that is
Right.
just learned. I'm not going to think about men make me uncomfortable because dad and this and all these compounding associations, so that when I'm around the situation my back does that. I'm not thinking about that. I'm just am I noticing triggers that are happening, and it's going, I could drop down into that level of consciousness and think about it if I was willing to turn the CPU off. Um, and and that's and
Yeah.
the further down you go, the weirder it gets. I mean, now you have computers with these AI chips essentially, where they're doing so much cross-referencing. A lot of these like LLMs and generating models have these vectors where they're pinging so many data sets that there's no record of what they actually did. Like we can see what they did, but we don't know. We can't like I can go through the GPU and say, okay, there's a bug. The background didn't render, so let me go through 10 spreadsheets, and in an hour I can find what was wrong. With an LLM, it tells you something and you don't know why it told you that. No one knows. There's no record. It's a black box. And so like those are
Yeah.
the kind of levels of consciousness for me. Is it's like eventually you do get into this black box thing where, during brain spotting, a ton of times people feel like, well, I didn't know what this, yeah, this is the incident. Well, what this other thing is familiar and it's terrifying and it's deeper than the incident, but what is it? And then later they're, oh, this was fourth grade or something, when you process it. And then they get to these places that just feel disembodying and terrifying. Like they're like, this isn't me. Like, I don't understand what this is. And, sometimes people have a kind of poetic understanding of like, oh, this is how mom felt when I was in the womb. She was afraid. Like this isn't even my emotion. This is what I was told to feel as I was. And of course,
Mm.
you could never prove that. No one could ever come in and say, well, yeah, epigenetics works this way, and like, there's no way to study this. But
No,
it still, I think, is valid if people are getting better and having some kind of self knowledge that maybe is not intellectual knowledge. I don't know. The profession's become
absolutely.
so afraid of that post the 80s, and Margaret Thatcher and Reagan come in, and everything is turned into this kind of objective metric in healthcare, and it is very much at war, I think, with good trauma therapy in a way that we're still having that fight.
Yes, yes. No, I mean, and again, I was thinking about the intergenerational aspects as you were speaking about the CPU and just like and also the CPU becoming kind of representing the high levels of dysregulation that can happen in trauma as well as the person gets out of their window of tolerance. The CPU's on 90 or whatever.
Hmm.
But there's something quite terrifying about that sort of erasure of the mechanisms that lead to something There's something really frightening about that, actually, and that kind of like makes me think about the unconscious, and the layers and the layers and the kind of the depths of it that we just don't know about.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm not a techno utopian that thinks we're going to download our brain onto a computer and live on a server or something. That just isn't
No, it
anything
didn't
that I
strike
indulge
me
at
as
all.
such. Yeah.
But I think that the I
Mm.
think that the metaphor there is kind of useful in just understanding
Yeah,
how information is processed.
yeah, absolutely,
Well,
absolutely.
is the book the beginning of, a greater model, is the next, the ritual or the totem or the, whatever is the next book on another metaphysical thing? Or is it more, this was just kind of something you're chewing on and your career
Mm.
goes, on to the next thing? Do you view it as kind of a piece of something? How
I
interrelated
think
is
I
it?
think it is. I think it is the beginning of something. I suppose at the moment I'm doing some writing on my Substack at the moment. So I wrote an essay recently called "The Daimonic Divine," which is really thinking about a bit more about the curse in relation to numinous experience, and how the curse is very much a person is in a kind of subjective prison, if you like. And ominous comes from the word omen, right? And I don't know if you've read Rudolf Otto's The Idea
Yeah,
of the
the
Holy,
numinous. Yeah,
the
yeah.
numinous,
That,
yeah. So
I'm familiar with the origin of numinous. I was going to ask you if we had longer, why you chose him
yeah,
over others.
so basically he thought, well, you've got omen, ominous, so he thought, well, not why not numinous, so he came up with a
Mhm.
numinous. And what's really interesting about that is that the numinous is it helps, it brings person into a more of an objective realm rather than this kind of subjective prison. Okay,
Mhm.
so I'm thinking about how the numinous can be a kind of cure in terms of helping somebody to think about or have a different experience with their own reality, if you like.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I suppose I'm thinking more about if in that from that perspective, how I can think about in terms of spirituality, in terms of healing. Um, yeah, here spiritual. So the numinous, mystery, the uncanny, synchronicity, all of these kind of things, and how. So building on what I'm saying in the book about magical curse consciousness, less about the actual curse itself, and more about those areas instead. Yeah. So yeah, moving towards healing and thinking about the role of art, particularly, and spiritual experience. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I don't know. Would love to have you on to talk about that when you get there. There's
Okay, thank you very much, Joel. Cheers.
Yeah, I'm kind of the opinion that like a lot of philosophy and psychology, if not all of it, and mythological anthropology maybe is just sort of fighting about object relations. That people are like, well, we have this inner world that doesn't match the outer world. Which one is valid? Well, the outer world feels real through spiritual
Yeah,
experience, so the inner world is more valid than the outer, or where does
yeah, we
knowledge
don't.
come from, and can they harmonize? How much can they harmonize? Why are they different? It's just
Yeah,
uh,
well, these are eternal conversations, and
yeah.
we could, it would be kind of hubristic, I think, to think that we can kind of solve those, because there are those tensions there, aren't there?
Yeah.
And it is very, very difficult. And again, a lot of our work with clients is trying to help them to pass out in some way what are those things, get a better understanding of the outer and the inner,
Sure.
the subjective and the objective as much as is possible.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
holding the tension without knowing. I mean, my
exactly.
even if I have a deterministic knowledge, it isn't something that is relevant to the patient. But it's their experience and their relationship with that tension.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. We'll definitely point to what do you want us to point to the book on Amazon and the website where
Great.
people can
That's
find it
great.
with you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Perfect.
And then
Thank
what is the web address? I don't have that in front of me. Well, actually I
you.
do.
So the web address is alexmonktherapy.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And if there's ever anything I can do for you, let me know. Would love to have you on again as new things come out.
Thanks very much, Joel.